Welcome to another live stream. We're going to talk about organized stalking, soft kill techniques. When targeted individuals are attacked, when they are thrown into this program, no one believes them. And I've talked about that many times. It's designed in a way to discredit them, to give them the sequelae of mental illness through paranoia, sensitization, to instill within them a seemingly unwarranted suspicion as they are attacked and the activity is obfuscated. There's a lot of plausible deniability around this. And, I've mentioned many, many times that underestimating the science around this is usually the mistake of the target. You don't really expect that you're going to be thrown into something that is not only this intense, but that can keep on going. It's not to say that all targets are dealing with the same thing, but there's definitely different levels of gang stalking, right? There's different levels of harassment, but usually for targets who've been doing this and have been, through the ringer, this is something that some people don't come back from. Okay. And I've talked about the fact that to me, it's attempted murder. It's reckless. A lot of the gaslighting that goes along with this activity, excuse me, it's basically there to minimize what's happening. It looks harmless, and some of the people that become involved in this whole thing, they just see their little part, depending on who they are. There's, some of these things are compartmentalized, and it's like, oh, you're overreacting, or boy, but they don't know the incremental subjection that the target is dealing with, the death of 1,000 cuts, that it can be a 24-hour thing for targets. And even if they do fall asleep, sometimes they deal with dream manipulation, nightmares from the stress, if nothing else, or sleep deprivation from noise campaigns, and maybe directed energy weapon attacks, or maybe even spiritual things, oppression. And it's, for them, it's easy to underestimate what the target's going through. And we've talked about that before. That some of these people are just thrown under the bus. There are casualties to these things, and some people do resort to street justice. They're provoked within that framework of emotional manipulation that involves that sense of injustice as they watch these individuals seemingly prosper in this world. Not only that, but just get away with what they're doing. And they're laughing at the target. They're mocking them. They're reminding them that they are either justified or that they're just going to get away with it. And I remember for me, as a believer in Christ, I had no idea. And as an early Christian, I would, watch the classic television programs and stuff like that. They would always have testimonies and and those other types of things, praise reports and so on. So nothing wrong with that, but it will almost suggest, if nothing else, that the miracles and those other things, which they think, it's not that God doesn't do that, but sometimes they do those things just to try to get people to, send in money or something like that. But you assume, even when you're watching some of those teachers and then you find out they're false teachers, you wonder why hasn't God removed them? How come he lets them do that? And then you're dealing with the stalking, you're dealing with harassment, and you assume that they're not going to be able to get away with this stuff. And you don't understand the framework. You're not really aware that God is allowing the testing of faith, and he has created an even platform for the diligent Christian to study and be set free by the truth, know the truth, and the truth will set them free. and to traverse the minefield of false doctrines and false teachers and all these things. And it's exponentially getting worse. When people talk about the last days, they often refer to our modern time. But really, if you want to get into the Dead Sea Scrolls, the last days involve the age of grace, which has been almost 2,000 years at this point, right? And I mentioned before that according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we just entered into the final Jubilee, and we just entered the first Shemitah, which is a 7-year period of that final Jubilee. And that I don't think the return of the Lord is very far away. But getting back to the point, you don't think it's going to go on. You think that somehow God is going to stop it, and that even to make it worse, some of these people, not only are they harassing targets and mocking them, they mock God, right? I've seen a few of them disappear off the planet eventually. But, and that's not good to think about. I've mentioned before, people will say, well, I kind of feel sorry for them. Well, I wouldn't waste my time doing that. but I do wish that they would repent. And but that's their choice, and they're gonna get what they got coming to them. The fact I was watching a sermon the other day, and a lot of people have been talking about the whole debacle of annihilationism with people out there. I'm not going to mention because I'm not trying to be sensationalistic, but it is concerning the biblical justice. There are different levels of hell. Of course, Jesus referenced. That it would be easier for Sodom and Gomorrah than it would have been for those individuals who heard his preaching and should have known the time of his visitation. And I've mentioned how they would have known that. And of course, they had the prophecies of Daniel. And after the decree of 444, you just take 7 years away from the 490 years of disobedience in exile. And then you take the 483 years and you multiply that times 0.9857 to convert it to the lunar calendar. And what do you get? When you take 444 away from it, you get 32 AD. They should have known. Getting back to the point, there are different levels of punishment. There are different levels of hell. I would speculate that for gang stalkers and the words of Jesus, that what you give and so on and so forth is going to be shaken down and pressed together and running over. So, these people are not giving targets grace at all. They're not going to receive that, and it's going to be exponential. But, like I've mentioned too, that as we traverse through our life, and as these individuals traverse through their rebellion, it just gets that much worse. Not only does their heart become hardened, but the guilt and the transgression pile up. A lot of people in that whole debacle of annihilationism will say, well, it's not fair because, the guy who was out in the Amazon who just didn't believe in Jesus, he's going to get punished the same as Adolf Hitler. Well, the Bible doesn't say that at all. In fact, when you get into the book of Enoch, there's some real interesting stuff. Whether or not it's not, I don't know, considered a canonical book, but I think there's some benefit to those things. But the point is there were different chambers. There were different realms for individuals concerning the transgressions and God's justice. And it's important to remember that because, as you're dealing with this stuff as a target, as you're dealing with these horrible techniques and the torture and injustice, one of the things that they will try to convince you of is that they're going to get away with it. People are going to believe, the lies, the disinformation, the smear campaign. They are going to believe maybe that you just went crazy. They're never going to know, and they're laughing. And the people at your workplace are looking at you like you're some kind of lunatic, maybe, depending on what's going on. The people in your family, individuals that you grew up around who you thought you could trust, maybe even with your life, turned against you or, started looking at you in a way where you feel you've lost your credibility and dignity. and it's very overwhelming. But these things are all going to come to light, and it's going to be laid out on the table for everyone to see. And you need to remember that the framework of organized stalking and harassment is it's almost like a spider web that they create. It involves technology, it involves science, it involves guerrilla warfare, it involves the demonic stuff. It involves everything. And I've mentioned before, don't ever try to separate, at least for me, the spiritual aspect from the technological aspect. And even as I referenced the book of Daniel earlier, all these things that we have, from laptops to nuclear weapons, are from them. Okay, there's nothing new under the sun. It's talked about in the Wisdom of Solomon, and all the possibilities and impossibilities have always been there for humans here on Zion, planet Earth. The dispensation of technology is at its max. And according to all those other prophecies, which I've referenced many times, according to Daniel and even Jeremiah, when you have the regathering of Israel and the book of Revelations and all those things, we are at the end of the latter times, and that would be the final 2,000 years before the millennium. And that technology has come to us from the spiritual dimension. So when I talk about that, because a lot of people, they try to run away from it, because it's almost like when a target deals with those techniques where they might hear footsteps, or something pounding on the wall, or scratching against maybe the wall in their bathroom as they're sitting there trying to but it's they can do that stuff with technology. Okay, it's not it's not to say that you have to believe in ghosts or something like that. It's not to say that there's a some type of dark creature hiding within the sheetrock that's a demon or something. I mean, we don't know exactly how those things work, but from what I understand and from what we can see, and from just basic deductive logic and reasoning, that they use technology and they try to break someone down, and eventually, as the Bible mentions, that they want to gain ownership over that individual, maybe even over a lineage or a family, and then they try to possess those people and live through them, and they find rest. And but a lot of people will avoid the spiritual connection there, and there's really no need to. These things, even with V2K and stuff like that, I believe that all that technology comes from the spiritual dimension. And one of the things that targets are confronted with, of course, in that spider web, in that labyrinth of gang stalking, in the methodology of this asymmetrical warfare, is how could this even logistically be possible? One of the huge dilemmas that targets deal with is the exponential reciprocity of attacks that come seemingly from everywhere. And I'm not even really referencing, how the themes can go into the whole thing, where targets are just finally awakened to the methods and the mechanisms that are out there in the theme-based world that we live in. They're there, and it's been activated against that individual. And of course, it just it seems like they've traveled into another dimension. Maybe they're on the Truman Show or whatever. Maybe they're in hell or purgatory. Maybe you died and you just don't know it. And it's like that movie, Jacob's Ladder, and you're just going through these different levels of consciousness and hell within your mind. But no, it's always been there. And that's one of the dangers of this whole thing, because as they are using these techniques on the target, and traumatizing them and discrediting them and just putting them through hell, that you move into those different levels of dysfunction, and then eventually you can go full blown psychosis, right? And when you get into the covert drugging and the sleep deprivation and just the stress and the exponential isolation, where the target is experiencing a subtle or maybe even an aggressive form of psychic driving through voices, through directed energy weapons or demonic oppression, that with the suggestion that they're being constantly watched. Maybe they're on a Truman Show or whatever. However, it's working out for them, whether they're dealing with that control programming or other things that just don't seem logistically possible. That they start to scrutinize themselves, and then like I mentioned, they want to turn you into your own handler. They want to turn you into your own enemy, because then not only can they save the money or whatever, but it's just wonderful. It's great to gaslight the targeted individual and exponentially increase the plausible deniability by getting them sensitized to these themes, and throw them within that psychological framework where they can gaslight them and send them off into that labyrinth of madness in the realm of psychosis. And I think it does happen. I've mentioned before, I don't know how many, who knows, how many people are out there in mental institutions right now. I mean, we've seen the things in MK Ultra, but we don't even know all of it. I mean, you get into those, sci-fi series like Montauk or something. They did that kind of stuff, man. Don't think for a minute that they didn't. It's sick. And like I said, that these things are reckless, but the gaslighting is going to try to get you to minimize this. And I think I mentioned in the last live stream is they'll get you to the point where you're just depressed or maybe even suicidal or even hostile or angry, and then they'll just oh, come on, just snap out of it. Oh, we weren't going to do anything, and they're terrorizing the individual. It's a game to them, but to you it's your life going down the crapper. And some of the obvious contradictions involved in the persecution, you have to anchor yourself to those things as a target, because the gaslighting is exponential, and they want you to buy into that. And I've talked about some of those contradictions before, and some of the obvious things that the perps have in common. They are engaged in illegal activity, and they're accusing the target of violating that framework, which is contradictive. And the negligence around their attack is that they're aggressive. And usually the target hasn't even done anything, but even if you have, there's other people that have probably done things to them, and they're not going after them. And you can see something else is going on here, especially when targets deal with this on an exponential level. They are isolated. They experience the character assassination, the rumors, the slander, the humiliation, that personal info that goes into the directed conversations to provoke the target. Maybe they want you to do something violent. Maybe they just want you to look crazy. Maybe they want you to attack loved ones so that they can gaslight you further to get you to internalize the torture. Maybe they want to experiment on you and just discredit you so that they can get away with it. And the target is faced with all those options. They get stonewalled, blackballed. They deal with the sabotage, and then of course the desired effect is through that gaslighting and internalization is low self-esteem, and hopefully they'll just be scapegoated by everyone at that point, throwing them into mental instability to maybe commit violence or just go nuts. And there are a lot of things that they use. Of course, we know the trauma techniques that cause paranoia. That's a huge part of it. First they want to set the framework though, and they might change the environment subtly and then move from that environmental tyranny to where it's kind of subtle, and they'll move into character assassination. It might even be behind your back, and then start manipulating you emotionally, sensitizing the target, and then getting very aggressive a lot of targets will talk about the break-ins, and sometimes it goes into levels where they deal with poisoning and covert drugging and so on and so forth. The fuming, and sometimes targets will deal with the surfaces being poisoned and so on and so forth. And a lot of targets will talk about that. I don't know, it's like a white powder or something. And I've heard a lot of targets talk about that. Some other targets will talk about the fuming, and I've heard one individual refer to it as brain gas. It just gives you a horrible headache. A lot of these things are just beyond anything you can imagine, and they threaten the target with directed conversations and innuendos, street theater. They will bully targets in traffic. They will use noise campaigns and stuff like that, and they just basically surround the target with that type of environmental tyranny that's going to drive them over the edge. And of course, they get them into the game dynamic because they want to use emotional manipulation, and they got to prick your ego. They got to get you in that place where you're trying to win, but you're outnumbered. There's no chivalry. And, the mechanism of isolating the target just starts to ramp down. And of course, it's designed in a way, I've mentioned, it's a lot like quicksand, because as soon as you start trying to solve these issues, it just gets worse, And once they discredit the individual, a lot of times they can push a false diagnosis on them, and they get labeled and so on and so forth. And you get that stuff on paper or in the electronic records that we have nowadays. It's beyond anything, because you can't get away. You can't get away. Of course, if they're not trying to reprogram the target, that soft kill just goes into the character assassination, and a lot of targets will have a hard time just getting anything done. They're dealing with people tampering with their mail. They're getting sabotaged on an exponential level. The psychological abuse puts them into depression. Anybody can become a TI, by the way, and that's another the facet of this. And I've mentioned before that there's probably a lot of people out there that they get a subtle form of this, and they just think they're nuts. They think they have some kind of disorder, but there's probably a lot of people, as I mentioned earlier, who have left the planet, if you know what I mean, and who knows, they've been in mental institutions for who knows how long. People have probably spent their lives within the confines of those places, because this is it's designed that way. And I've mentioned, it's one thing to deal with this type of tyranny as a free moral agent of society. It's another thing to deal with this stuff after they push you or frame you, or whatever they're going to do, and the individual goes to jail, or they end up maybe in a psychiatric facility, maybe even a state hospital or something. And they're always threatening targets with that too. And because most of you are dealing with the aggressive stuff, where they're just outright telling you they're going to drive you crazy, or threatening you with other things. And that's what I dealt with. They would do that to me. We're going to lobotomize you. And this stuff goes all the way back into my childhood too, where these people would just say something to me. It's creepy how that works. And of course, it's a little seed that's sown for later. And once the target starts to deal with this stuff, then it becomes real. You just think they're weird before that. And then, as the target experiences the environmental tyranny and the subjection to this nightmare, it becomes serious. It becomes believable. And you don't take it the same way. It's serious. And it's like, then you get the dreams and everything else, and you don't know what to believe. I had a guy ask me, I think it was a guy, about dreams and stuff like that. And because one of the things that I've mentioned before concerning the secret societies and how the elites are deceived is through that destiny philosophy, the destiny mythos of the secret societies involving divine manipulation and false prophecy illustrated by Paul in Deuteronomy 13, 1 through 5, where God will allow the prophecies of the counterfeit to come to pass to test people out. And this individual was because I've had those things where, people talk about deja vu, but you have, dreams that are like premonitions and stuff like that. Or you might deal with someone in witchcraft or someone involved in the new age or doing readings or something, or even maybe something as simple as a fortune cookie. I've seen that before. There was a guy that I used to work with who, I believe in these fortune cookies can be real. And I'm like, yeah, well, and I tried to tell him how it works because, even with astrology and all those things, they set these things up, right? And you speculate how all that stuff works. You speculate how you can have deja vu about something that hasn't happened yet. Well, it hasn't happened to you yet. That I've mentioned before, speculatively, when you get into time dilation, which I have that up on the community page, basic law of relativity that, that there's a way that you can see things in advance dimensionally before, the creatures like us in the terrestrial world, we experience it in real time. And so you could probably put a pre-download in someone's brain with that information, and then there would be a type of connection there. You could give them dreams and so on and so forth, right? And that information is going to freak them out. But what's the tool? Why would they do it? And I mentioned that because this guy was like, well, maybe it's a gift from God. I'm like, well, I don't know. But what are you getting out of it? What's the byproduct of this whole thing? It's probably driving you crazy, isn't it? It's probably just tripping you out. Are you really getting any information that's useful? Because because they'll do that, and then you think it's helped you out. It's kind of like Anakin, where he was having all those dreams, and then they just used it to manipulate him, and then he goes and does something, and it's just kind of like the street theater or whatever. They want you to be afraid and react, but with something like that, they could lie to you later after they get your confidence, where you're starting to pay attention to dreams and all these things and prophecies, or who knows what it is, because that's what they do to the elite. And they have prophecies, they have all these things laid out way in advance, hundreds of years minimum, more than that actually. And it will deceive them. I've seen those things happen. Some targets will deal with those types of directed conversations, really, twist your brain. How do they know? And then there's a lot of targets who deal with that kind of thing where, it's like people are reading their mind. You speculate on all those things. And I referenced the technology earlier, but the 6 of this, half on the other, didn't really matter. And so, you move within that framework of the secret societies. They're deceived that way. And for me, I just quit paying attention to all that stuff, but targets deal with that kind of thing. And they might want to try and convince somebody, and then, get their attention and trust, and then take them somewhere else. And you can usually see the contradiction, and you have to use the word of God as your foundation. But, they'll convince people that they're prophets, or they'll convince other people to follow someone that they want them to believe they're prophets. And of course, Christ said, a wicked and perverse generation looks for a sign and a wonder. I stay away from that stuff. I stay away from it altogether. But the framework that you're dealing with involves all those things, right? And they want a byproduct of propositional tyranny, confusion, anxiety, fear, paranoia, frustration, anger, and they want to take you into a place where they can reprogram you. But what's the effect of all this harassment that targets deal with? Is their reputations are destroyed. It's seemingly their future, at least in this world, to them, because depending on who you are, especially if you're not a believer, you think this is everything. This is all there is. It's not, though. Well, that would be sad if it was. And I've mentioned that before. You throw the spiritual element of this out, and there is no hope because this is it. I mean, you're up against what? A cabal that's out there: the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, the DHS, the DOD, NATO, right? CIA, MK Ultra, COINTELPRO. I mean, you got all kinds of things going on. You've got experimentation. You've got a hierarchy, an infrastructure, the Freemasons, the Illuminati, the Rosicrucians. You go all up into the Committee of 300, all the way to high Freemasonry. What are you going to do about it? If there is no God, there is no justice, right? But of course there is, and we can see the evil involved in this whole thing. And that right there should tell you something, right? A lot of people run into that, the problem of evil. How do you explain that? Well, there's a way to explain it. How do you explain some of the other themes that are out there in the world, right? That are prophesied by the Bible? That's because that's where the truth is. That's where these things come into play. Some targets will deal with, the noise campaigns involving some pretty intense stuff. I mean, in fact, it was probably, I think it was a few years ago where everybody was talking about all these explosions, and I was hearing them. It was like people were being desensitized to it. Huge. I mean, we're not talking like big firecrackers. We're talking about stuff that shake your house, and it was happening a lot. People were talking about it. It wasn't just targets. Everybody was talking about it. Boom! And where the hell did that come from? And nobody seemed to know. It was like they were paying people to, go on the outskirts of town and light off these huge bombs, or explosive devices or something. The targets will deal with. They'll walk outside, and they get the vehicles, coming by. A lot of targets will deal with that. They'll honk, or they'll rev their engines, or maybe even flip you off. They want to get aggressive, or just circle the block or whatever. You just got to ignore it. Park outside your house with a stereo blasting or whatever. I got to the point where it just puts me to sleep, man. They can do it all they want. It just literally, it took a long time. It took a long time to get to that point. And they actually had a speaker under the trailer that I was living at for a while there. And it was a story. I've told this story before. I might as well tell it again for those of you who haven't heard it. But, my life before was like clockwork because I was on tranquilizers. And of course, unless you're on the medication, you're pretty much going through withdrawals, and you're not going to be able to sleep without it. So you could pretty much time everything. And the creepy part, we've talked about this many times, is that, some of these attacks are synchronized around things where how would they know what you're doing inside your house unless they could see in there somehow? All right. So to make a long story short, I go lay down, I turn off the lights, and I'm laying there. And then all of a sudden, it's what it sounded like was a vehicle with one of those huge subwoofers coming down the street towards my trailer, and it get louder. It would get louder. And I'm laying there, and of course I only have so much time to fall asleep before the pills wear off. And then I've got to go another 8 hours and do it all over again. So they keep me up sometimes for weeks, months. But this, so I can hear the stereo coming down, and it just sounds like it's right out in the driveway, just rattling. The whole house is shaking. It sounds like the screws are going to come out of the, it's like the windows are about to break. So of course I get up, and I was at the very far end of the trailer, and there was a bathroom, and then a kitchen, a living room, and then 2 bedrooms, and another bathroom. And then of course you could see out to where the parking space was out there in the driveway. So as soon as I would get up and I would open the door, I would start walking through that utility area, the music would start to fade out. Now, it was almost like they were pulling out of the driveway and leaving. And remember, this is like a retirement community, very strict rules. And by the time I got to the living room, it would be gone. And so at first you're like, And then after it keeps happening, you're like, they know I'm getting up out of bed, and they know I'm going towards the window, but how? And so at that point, what's the suggestion? There's cameras in your house. right? And with the internet the way it is, it's like, well, who knows what on then, you're like, oh my gosh, they're watching, I mean, walk around in my underwear. A lot of targets will talk about that. And some targets will even get, a little, area where they'll, put blankets up or something so they can, change or, start showering in their swimsuit or whatever. So some targets don't, they just get to the point where they don't care. And it's almost like they're trying to dissociate you into alters so they can just turn you into some kind of nut. And you get fierce just to try to deal with the environmental tyranny. And so I'm thinking, getting back to what I was dealing with, I'm like, well, I know I'll just put a camera up out there. And I put one up, hooked it up to the VCR. And I'm like, okay, because they did it for weeks. And I laid down. Of course, here it comes. And it gets up there and it just starts, rattling the whole trailer. And I go, okay, let's see who the hell these people are. And I get up and I go play it back. Of course, it faded out as soon as I started walking through that utility area. And of course, it's just like they drove away. There was no one out there, man. There was no one coming down the street. There was no one, anywhere near the trailer or any vehicles at all, anything. And so I'm thinking, oh, they got a speaker. They're just turning the volume up and turning the volume down, right? So I'm yelling. I'm in the middle. It's like in the middle of the night, all by myself in my trailer, yelling, hey, I'll tear this place apart and find it, you son of a, and I'm yelling, and it never happened again. Never happened again. Then there was other times where they'd have somebody waiting under there and they just hit the bottom of either that or they had a device under there. Boom, right under where I was sleeping, it'd make you jump, the wait until you're just about ready to fall asleep. Well, boom. And, you go out there and then of course, you got those little vinyl panels and they're all moved out of the way. You could tell somebody's running around under there. But they'll do that kind of thing, and they'll keep targets awake. Insomnia is deadly. You're awake for so many hours, and you're considered legally insane. I can't remember what that is. I think if you're awake for more than like 5 days, I think it's you're bordering on to where you're not even responsible for your actions if you can prove it. I don't know if I'm correct on that. Maybe I'm wrong, but there's something I've heard things like that before. But you get those people doing that, and it's just horrifying for targets because it's like, especially in the beginning, because they'll say things to you and threaten you, get you to fear for your life. It's not only the poisoning and everything else or whatever. It's the workplace threats. I dealt with that. One of the guys at a pizza place I was working at when it really got kicked off about a year or so after I started getting the intense overt stalking, is why it can get violent, And I'm like, oh, really? And then they brought this, big lumberjack guy in that had arms the size of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and they really started messing with me then. I know they infiltrated that guy in there for that. But, that just wasn't my way of dealing with it anyway. But you mix all that stuff together, the target is dealing with that on an exponential framework. It doesn't seem like there's any rest. It's like a 24-hour deal. And, you get to the point where you're wore out. And, it's, even, when they did those things, you and Cameron would break people down. He would call it depatterning. So that they could, and basically they took people back into infancy in MK Ultra. They didn't just experiment on people, that were, I don't know, in mental institutions or whatever. These were citizens, their family would come to visit them and they're in this, vegetative state. They keep them, I can't remember what they called that. It was, I can't remember what the name of that was. They would, he would keep them asleep sometimes for like a month and play, things over and over in these headphones and keep them heavily sedated and, give them LSD and everything else. And, that psychic driving was used. And then, they were, they forgot how to eat. They would forget everything. They would basically be reduced into an infant-like state. in a state of an invalid from the torture. And I've mentioned before that for targets, you're in an aggressive program, but I think everybody has been subjected to these things. It was right after MK Ultra, right around that time, Timothy Leary purchased, I think it was for $250,000, the basically the supply of LSD out there, and they used it, and it was everywhere though. And then you get into the CIA, the psyops and stuff, where you get into like Charlie Manson and some of those other games, and even COINTELPRO or other things, where they were using that kind of thing. And I've mentioned before, I think some of the people in Hollywood and even politicians were probably the survivors of some of that MK Ultra stuff that was extended to create those people that have alters and super abilities that can handle that type of stress and dysregulation. But I'm going to go into the comments and see who's out there. Okay, and Simon, welcome. Gang stalking must end. Welcome to the live stream. And it looks like people are talking about moderators here. And hopefully we don't have a perp in here. I have not been paying attention. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and go through this. And gang stalking must end said perps are in the chat. Okay, I'm not seeing anything yet. Everything looks legit so far. I am not seeing it yet. Dead Pirate Lenny, welcome to the live stream. Okay. Naya Thomas, welcome to the live stream. Firth Thou 8, welcome. I'm not seeing any perps in here yet. So I don't know what's going on out there. Maybe somebody erased them. I didn't get a chance to see it, but I'm not seeing anyone in here that's doing anything yet. Maybe I just haven't scrolled up to that point. I apologize if that's the case. Felix. Okay. Well, they're saying someone in here should be booted out of here. I'm not seeing anything so far. I'm not seeing anything bad so far. So, sometimes I'll even let Chief Handler come in and use him as an example. As long as he doesn't get too bad, then I usually have to get him out of here. Okay. And gang stalking must end since you've been tortured since '93. So have I. I could go further back than that, but that's about the time of the overt stalking and harassment. You don't look that old. You look really young. You've aged well. Unless I'm thinking someone else. I'm pretty sure I know who you are. And by the way, I put a link to the Facebook Harassment Support Group 911, and I have offered for individuals for anonymous or first name only testimonies to be on the channel. And of course, the rules are in there. No profanity, no pornographic type of, because a lot of targets will deal with some very explicit sexual stuff. And it's okay to mention that you're dealing with that, just as long as you don't go into too many details, because they're like that. They're gross. They mess with targets like that. And, you got to be careful of what it's like when you sensitize other people with stuff that you put out online. You don't want to do that. And no mentioning of other channels or individuals for the target individual community, and no promotion of any other religion but Christianity. And those are the rules. But I would love to get your testimony out there. And I mentioned before that I want to protect individuals. And I want to be consistent. And so there is a picture of a silhouette that I put in the Facebook harassment support group 911, and that will be your avatar. And unless you're a female or something, we could probably get one of those because I want to be consistent. It's not that you can't do that. I just don't want to be the one responsible for that. Okay. So if you want to tell people this is me and I was on, gang stalking with Dr. De Facto and, I did my testimony and here's what like, you do whatever you want. That's up to you. You can do whatever you want with that. I don't want to be the one because there are people out there who become fierce. They become, disillusioned and they're dealing with a lot of things and they go on and they start telling everybody about it. And this happens in families too, where, they start talking about this stuff to people and later they wish they could take that back. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to, this is a worldwide platform. Not only that, but I've mentioned before that there are hunters, there are perps in the community, and they're harassing targets, and they want your personal information, using your real name and showing your face and everything. It's dangerous. Okay, it just is. Period. People are threatened, and I've heard that from a lot of targets. They get attacked. So I made a video, and they would come after me. Well, yeah. Well, you don't help them out, but I would love to do that. And so I put that option up there. We'll be doing it through StreamYard. And I'll send you the link once you get a hold of me and we can do it. It won't be live. And so if you change your mind and decide that it's not good enough, you want to redo, we can do that. Or if you just want me to erase it, and of course, I'll go ahead and comply with that. But I think it'll be interesting to get those things out there for people. Okay. Oh, Nicholas Boserman, we have a moderator here. And I'll let you decide who needs to be X'd out of here. I haven't really seen anything bad so far. Max, welcome. And Simon says parents sell their kids all the time. Yeah, there's a lot of creepy stuff, and I've heard of that kind of thing too. And way back when they started doing this stuff, it was easier for them to get away with it because people were more compliant and indoctrinated. Nowadays, people know what's going on, especially since the pandemic. I'm not going to mention anything specific, but even the medical community was exposed, and it's like people are waking up. But back in those days, they would, they just follow orders, and they assumed that people could be trusted. Boy, were they wrong, huh? Oh my, were they wrong? Horrible things that have been done in the name of science. And these people were doctors. And, when you get into MK Ultra and stuff like that, like I said, you and Cameron or other people, nurses, some of them might have been confused, that they had some kind of new sleep therapy or whatever the hell he used to. I mean, really, people are turning into invalids, and it's beyond anything you can imagine. But people are waking up. But back then it was easier, and children were involved. It's horrible. I can think back to things that happened, and it makes me wonder. A lot of people wonder exactly what kind of a program they're in, or what was going on. I've talked about that before. Some of the stuff that happens in the public schools and everything has had people wondering if that wasn't, one of the facets to these extended MK Ultra like programs, and something similar to Montauk or whatever. But they were just kind of profiling people, and even some of the things involved in the remote viewing and that Project Stargate that involved some of those things. And that was basically from the occult. They just didn't know it. But I used to hang around with a guy who went into Black Ops, but I would take him hunting. And when we would be out hunting, we'd be walking through the hills and the coulees, and This used to happen to me a lot, to where, we'd be moving into a certain area and I'd go, okay, get down. And, we'd get down and I go, okay, I have a feeling there's something over this hill. I'm serious. Get ready. And I was right most of the time. And it freaked him out. Okay. Am I psychic? No. And who knows what was going on with that? It could have been even something demonic messing with me. But the point is that I didn't know exactly what he was talking about when he was going into the Air Force, but he went into the Black Ops, and he started asking me a lot of questions about that kind of thing. And he tried to recruit me into a program at one point. He said, you should contact the military. I was like, I'm not going to contact the military. But he ended up going into that. And I wonder sometimes if he didn't flag me, if he didn't mention me, and maybe that had something to do with some of the stuff that happened to me, but you don't know. You're speculating. It's almost like that delusion of grandeur, or that persecutory delusion, because, a lot of these things will feed and you just don't know. You have to remember you're speculating, but they do those types of things. And I'll go back into the comments here. Yeah, Nicholas says he's not insulting anyone. Well, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You have to really push a button to get out of here. But I can smell a perp, and if you cross the line, I'll just, you'll have to come in on a different profile. I'm just telling you, I'm not going to get excited about it. But vegan, welcome. Joe, welcome to the live stream. And let's see what this is about. Let's put this one up there. In some geographical locations and on targets who are aware of the spiritual, they use more witchcraft than technology. Okay. And I dealt with that. The thing is, I think that the way I look at it, you have individuals who are in a communion or involved in that type of activity. They think they're doing those things. They are more of a conduit and a point of contact for you, right? So they're the ones that, you're within earshot of them. They are the ones that the spiritual entities are going to work through to get into your head, to get into your life. But really, those are just people. So the spells and all that kind of thing, yeah, that stuff is real, but how is it real? Because they're not the ones doing it. It's the big boys. It's the spiritual. But I think they use technology a lot of times. And there's a lot of things. I think when they're doing things to people, whether they, are inducing panic attacks or terrorizing them with dreams, I think it's pretty much all the same. So I think the witchcraft can be technology too. And I think that it's mixed together. So I just wanted to do that. The people involved in it, they think they are the ones with these powers. And it seems like it, right? It's like some of the things you hear about when you have these new age gurus where they'll say, okay, I'm going to give everyone in the audience a bright flash of gold and a feeling of peace. And it happens. It's not them. It's not the people. And it's technology or some kind of spiritual thing or a mixture of both. And that's where you get into the deception. And I've mentioned that, when you get into the occult, or even when you get into some of the Christian cults or whatever, where these false teachers, is that, these people will be literally getting high around them, and they will have an emotional anchor, and it's like emotional conditioning, and they will form a type of relationship with that. And that it's very hard to break people away from those beliefs because they believe it because of the way they feel. It's like Mormonism. You feel the burning of the bosom, and then there's the prosperity and all the other things. And people just assume that it's true because they're led into that. Like I mentioned earlier, that, when people start paying attention to, wonders and signs and stuff like that, yeah, you got to watch that, because if you need a sign Guess who's going to give that to you? The enemy will give you a sign. He'll give you a dream and all those things. I got to the point where I don't pay attention to any of it. And you can do whatever you want. Some people will say that's controversial because in the latter times, old men will dream dreams and people will have visions. But remember what that means. In context, that's the final age before the millennium. That's the 2,000 years. And remember that even when you get into the passage of, the trampling of the snakes and scorpions and all the power of the enemy, that was mostly for what Jesus was talking about when he sent out the 70 or the 72, depending on when you were looking at the Masoretic or the Septuagint. And those people were apart from the 12 apostles, where he, around the Mount Hermon area, said that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church, right? And then he sent them out to declare the kingdom of God was at hand. And that was a fulfillment of Psalm 82, that God would take back the nations. An extenuation, and it's kind of an extended version of Deuteronomy 32:8, where the principalities and powers were judged, where the nations were given over to them, and they failed on that whole thing, and that they were judged in Psalm 82, and that God would take back the nations. And so they went out, and they weren't even really true believers. They actually walked away from the Lord after that, but he gave them that authority temporarily. And so, that's where you get into people nowadays who think that they're going to be an exorcist or something, or, the snake handlers and all that stuff. They think, they try to take it. They don't understand the context of that whole thing. But so, misinterpreting those scriptures. And then you have all these, fake deliverance ministries and stuff like that, where rather than having a relationship with the Lord and looking at really what's going on with deliverance, it's usually that's incremental. When people get a quick fix deliverance, or they just get delivered, usually that doesn't work out very well for them, because then they think, well, I ain't going to mess around with no Ouija boards no more, and they'll be just fine. But they don't grow, they don't learn, they're not really spending time with the Lord or in his word or whatever, and it's useless. Well, as long as I'm not looking at pornography, I'll be okay. Demons ain't going to get me. Well, no, they're coming after everybody. And in the case of the targeted individuals, it's exponential in that. But the deliverance is something that goes over time, even when you get into the controversy of losing your salvation. Well, if you conflate salvation with an event, similar to the problem Augustine ran into, or Augustine, with infant baptism or baptismal regeneration, you have to conflate salvation with an event, which means that later they lost their salvation. But really, salvation is a journey, right? It's a journey. Today is a day of salvation. And the good news is that you have a merciful high priest in Christ, and that if you sin, you have an advocate with the Father. And so then you get into these cults and misinterpretations of maybe Hebrews chapter 6, where you can't be renewed to repentance because you've sinned. No, I was talking about apostasy up around the temple area when people went back to the old system under the old covenant. It had nothing to do with you. But so what'll happen is they'll get confused about those things, and then they'll get persecuted by the enemy, or maybe they're victims of gang stalking, and someone will, you lost your salvation. No, all you have to do is get back up on the horse. You're not, until you're dead, it's not over. And that's why, it's like when you talk about the gang stalkers, well, they repent. Can they? Well, yeah, they can do it. It's going to be hard. They're making it harder for themselves, but they can do it, right? And, you have to interpret those things properly, but, you can't conflate that with an event. But getting back into, the soft kill and, the exponential harassment that targets deal with, you're dealing with all those things. And when you get into witchcraft or, directed energy weapons, some of you guys are dealing with all of it, and I think that's where we got all that stuff. That's where we got that technology. I'm going to go back into the comments. Okay. And Fert Thou 8 says, I think it's all more connected. than you think. And I'm not sure if you're specifically in a conversation with somebody, but in general, I think you're right. Absolutely. It's all connected. Absolutely. That's a good point. That's a great one there. And Simon says, a question for the doctor. Have you gone to Montauk for a walk around? Just no, I've never done that. There's other islands that they've done these things on too. Even, it's not even the sexual stuff like Epstein Island. There's other stuff out there. I think up by Lake Michigan or something. There's something out there too. I can't remember where it is, but there's all these things out there. In fact, I put something up on the Facebook harassment support group 911, where they've actually had drone footage where they think that Epstein might still be alive. And of course, I don't know, but to me, that would seem realistic. Think about that. Okay. Yeah. And incognito security says technology is the science of craft. That is true. I've never really gone into it, but I've heard people talk about it. Even when you get into Freemasonry, that stuff is there. That's the hidden knowledge and secret wisdom, you know, and that's how they create the hierarchy. They were trying to turn lead into gold, right? And that was the big thing. You get into alchemy and all those things when you get into Freemasonry. You get into the higher levels, you learn all those things. It's science, but it's also like witchcraft. And a lot of people will talk about CERN, and some people have speculated that they're trying to open up, a porthole for these angels, for the ones in Revelations that come up out of the abyss. I don't think that's it at all. No, I don't think so. God's in control of those things. I think they're trying to find out how to control the creation of God because, and I've mentioned this before, it's almost like nanotechnology, right? I mean, you can say, electrons, neutrons, protons, whatever, dark energy, and it's just like a word because we can't see them. I mean, it's like the quantum science that's not really observable. It is, but it's not. But we know that it's there, and we have a lot of information now. And when they're smashing these particles together, they're looking for the God particle. They want to be able to control what everything is made up of. When Jesus turned a piece of dirt into an eyeball, right? He can do that. Or when he was tempted, and Lucifer said, "Well, if you're the Son of God, you can turn these rocks into bread." He could have done it too. Absolutely, right? And he can do that. He can take all those things. He's sovereign over the creation, and he could do that. He could turn your house into a big brick of gold if he wanted to, whatever. And when you get into what happened with Moses and those sorcerers, right? They had a staff that turned into a snake, and then so Moses threw his down, and it turned into a snake and swallowed up. That can happen, but they're trying to figure out how to do all that. They want to be able to control all those things. They're not trying to open a porthole. They've already done that stuff, right? And some people would speculate, or they've traveled back in time. I think that is gaslighting. And it's similar to, it is actually directly connected to the Mandela effect, because the Mandela effect gets people to believe that kind of thing. They set that up in advance. That's mass gaslighting. And it also involves, technology. People are looking back on old movies that they bought or whatever. And some of it is just different versions. And they use hypnosis and other things to where they'll distract people. And then they throw it all out there for everybody. And they'll see something like, maybe, Luke, I am your father off of the Star Wars. And then now, no, I'm your father. And it's like that people are like, well, they changed it. They went back in time. It's what they did up at CERN. and they dimensionally changed everything. Well, no, they set that up. They want you to believe those things, right? Even when you get into like movies like The Karate Kid, they're saying that was involved in the CIA. I believe it. And you get into the Karate Kid bandana thing, and everybody remembers the sunburst, and other people remember the lotus, but they'll do that. Or you get into Moonraker, that was a pretty good one with Dolly and the braces or whatever. Or you get into some of the other things. It's gaslighting, and they'll set it up in advance in a lot of different ways. But they could probably technically, like some targets will talk about, things just activating, and that's before Bluetooth. I mean, I've had analog electronics be manipulated before, literally turn on and off, and some of them weren't even plugged in, man. And you can think I'm crazy if you want, but I'm not. And I've seen that kind of thing happen. So they can do a lot of they can do all those things, and who knows what they can do. They can get rid of footage with that Nevada testimony. That stuff would disappear. You get video evidence and it's gone. I've had it happen to mine, and I got a hold of the company that made my security system, and they said there must have been some kind of a Bluetooth hack. They don't know. Set back to 1973, and all the footage gone after somebody coordinated, like literally broke into my house 15 feet away from me while I was cleaning out my air conditioner for the summer. That was funny, right? But they can do a lot with technology. It is, witchcraft. I think it's all mingled together. Tesla. Need we say more? Okay. All right. And Nicholas says, the science of the craft. I like how that's stated. I felt that way for a long time. V2K is tech, but you could use it as witchcraft. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, man. We're on the same page, brother. Because a lot of people will separate that whole thing. It's like, well, it's a demon. No, it's not. They use it. That's what I think. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. That's how I look at it. And Terrence Brown, it looks like you've just entered into the matrix of gang stalking for your 5 years, which is a milestone for somebody I remember the first 5 years, it was just like, it was an eternity. The first 2 years was you don't think this stuff is going to keep going. And Terrence Brown says 5 years, still don't understand the purpose. It seems meaningless. It's frustrating. And the worst part about it is that they'll try to convince you that there is a reason, but we're trying to help you, or it's your character defects, or you just don't get it, or you got to go find the X out in the middle of the desert or something like Nevada testimony or some other thing. And I played all those games. And then because you'll do it, you're trying to make it stop, and they like that. And then when they get to the point where you start realizing that it's all lies. And that's when they start losing leverage. And that's when you get into that Nevada stalking testimony, where they finally just basically, basically just mind blasted that individual and just stalled them out. They can do that. I've seen that before. They'll literally hit you so hard you freeze up. You don't even know what's going on. It's like you're in a trance. It's scary, the things that they can do. But getting back into Terrence Brown, it's frustrating. It seems purposeless, and it's even worse when they start pretending like you're dealing with God. They'll play God with you. All right, the V2K will pretend like it's God. The demonic entities will pretend like they're God, and that's worse. And then you get into these people with the exponential gaslighting and the environmental tyranny around that, And they start convincing targets that they're right. It's horrifying. And I remember when I got to the 10-year mark, it was like, oh my gosh. And when I got out there to 15 years, I was like, okay, because I would mark down every year. The ball would drop on New Year's, which we are approaching. I don't know if any of you guys did that. And I will think back, and sometimes I'll have those flashbacks on New Year's, and I'll remember what happened. And it's like, man, I remember the first 15. At that point, I was like, okay, I think this might just be going all the way until this is, until the end of my life. And it was at that moment that I realized that I had to start thinking, and I had to quit, jumping from one foot to the other and playing little games and everything, and just realize that, you got to ignore this stuff for the most part. It's like that movie, The Edge, where Anthony Hopkins and all those guys out there, Alec Baldwin, they figured out nobody was coming for them, and they had to walk out. They had to, forget about, sitting around. They had to get on it, and they had to try to be proactive in the sense. And for targets, to make that happen, and for targets, that's about, just, getting into things that you can control, and, working on your health. Because they'll distract you and, just turn you into a dysfunctional nut, and nothing gets done. You'll be distracted. Your hobbies will be neglected. If you like music or whatever, if you, like whatever, they want to take all those things and taint them and use the amalgamated associations through trauma, mind control to trigger all that stuff within that matrix, to where everything reminds you of gang stalking, and you can't let them do it. You work on your finances, whatever. You have to try to put one foot in front of the other and simplify your life. Prayers out for you, Terrence. Hang in there. You could do it. Watch my videos. Okay. And we have the professional demon slayer in the comments. Okay. I don't. Yeah. We'll just keep going on that. I'll just leave that alone. Okay. We're having a conversation out there. Okay. We have another conversation going. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay. We have some opinions going. Nothing wrong with that. Okay. Nothing wrong with that. I'm going to show this one. This is on topic of what we were talking about from Felix. I distinctly remember perps on the street trying to get me to think what was happening to me was witchcraft. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that goes into what I was talking about with the hauntings and stuff like that. I think Robert Duncan has talked about that stuff too. But the thing is it, like I said, six of this, half dozen the other. I think it's all technology anyway. When you look around at what we're dealing with, these are reflections of what is beyond. And whether it's a laptop or, like I said, a nuclear bomb or whatever, a rocket ship, when you get into the Operation Paperclip, where we gave the Nazi scientists a pass to come in and give us all these things that they've been working. They were into the occult heavily. That was beyond evil, and it was even, you know it was like witchcraft, occult stuff, and they got their technology that way. So I mean, you gotta look at it for what it is. I'm just saying. But yeah, okay. And we got a comment here from Joe. The entities are intelligent. There has been an entity that causes power surge only when I plug in my phone to the power out. Interesting. I've seen weird stuff. I mean, like I had a pastor over at one time and we were recording a song that he played that he had made. And it was on an 8-track, not no, an 8-track. It was one of those, 8-track recorders where you can dub 8 different tracks, not like an old 8-track thing. You have the 4-track recorders and the 8-track. It was a pretty nice one for back then. It was in the 90s. I bought that in like 93 or something. I don't remember. But we were recording. He was playing guitar, and I had the whole thing sitting there, and it starts tweaking out, and it starts stopping and rewinding and going fast forward. And these are like the old buttons where you had the old tape recorder where you click down the button and fast forward and, rewind it and play. And it was going off, and he's just looking at me, and I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. I wonder what's going on. That was an analog thing. It didn't even have, wireless stuff back then. And I even unplugged it and it kept going. He took off. He left. Never came back. Never came back in there. He was a Calvinist pastor. So I don't think he would have been much into the exorcism stuff anyway. But I've seen that kind of thing. I'm not going to question you. Okay. And Simon thinks that Epstein is still alive. Who knows? It would make more sense to me. I mean, think about it. If you're a guy he was in the CIA. If you're a guy that has that much information, you're not going to be that stupid. It's like a 0-day virus. As soon as you die, that information, you want to kill me? Do you think you're going to get rid of the evidence that way? Oh, I've got it set up. I've got people out there that I have information on them, and as soon as something happens to me, it's on. It's public. It's like WikiLeaks. They're not gonna mess with a guy like that. He's got too much dirt. The whole thing was a psyop, man. They had cameras. They got everybody. They got dirt on all of them, man. Right? It's a treasure trove of corruption. So I wouldn't doubt it. But then again, I'm speculating. I don't know. Okay. Okay. New Neo, welcome to the live stream. I'm trying to get through these comments. Okay. Shadow Band, welcome to the live stream. Okay, looks like you're dealing with some noise campaigns. We'll put that up there. And Shadow Band says, I was just trying to sleep, and then a car starts revving very loudly. Yeah, I've seen that kind of thing. And just sitting. And a car sirens for 2 seconds just to let you know. So it's almost like a synchronized thing. I've seen that. And the scary part is that some of these things, it's like they don't even know what they're doing. I'm not saying that's what's going on in your scenario, because some of them do know. But it seems like sometimes the whole thing can crescendo within a symphony that the spiritual dimension is orchestrating. And it's like when you say something or try to call somebody out or whatever, then they literally don't know. And that's weird, because it's like, they just get something in their head to go do something. And who knows what's going on in their world. They're getting manipulated too. And, there you are. But they don't know. It's like the stuff I was talking about earlier. It's the death of 1,000 cuts, is that they're not aware of the incremental stuff that's going on. A target could be dealing with sleep deprivation, nightmares, technology that puts them into a state of anxiety or depression. They could be dealing with V2K, and then all of a sudden they come along, and it's all a huge cocktail of tyranny that is just beyond anything to push you over the edge. But the problem is that how is it all working? And that's the problem, is that sometimes they are working in a collusion, they know, and then sometimes they are being manipulated. Okay. Oh, Mr. Beach Walker, welcome to the live stream. And Mr. Beach Walker says anything can be used for evil purposes. That's a good point. I'm going to put that up there because, that's really when you get into the dispensation of technology, back in the Genesis 6 account. We had the problem of fallen man who needed to be reconciled to God, and the tyranny of the evil one upon the earth. But to exacerbate that, now we've got all this technology and makeup and weapons of war and alchemy and sorcery and everything. It just made it worse. You can kill somebody with a, I don't know, a rock, but or maybe an eating utensil or something. But it just perverts everything. But that's a good point, Mr. Beachwalker. Anything could be used for evil. And unfortunately, now that we have all this technology, of course, it's like the stuff that they're saying they're going to use to help people. The interface between human beings and the internet, that's horrifying. Augmentation, where we're supposedly moving to a new level of evolution, where we're gonna meld that stuff within the human, and they're trying to do this thing. To connect. That, or even enhance people with these chips, and whether a lot of targets will talk about implants. I think that stuff is real. I think that people have been doing that. They say you don't need it anymore. I think that they're still using that kind of thing. And Delgado was the first one to mention that was where we were headed, and they're trying to do it. I don't know if God's going to allow that or not. He may return before that, but the thing is, they're trying to do that. And it's just it's wild. They say that we're just we want to find out, like Terry Shinoshivo. Is she conscious? Is it really okay for us to use euthanasia on certain people, or people who are in comas? Are they really gone or whatever? Or maybe people that are blind, or they try and say that they're doing that stuff, or even that technology with extracellular matrix and embryonic stem cell stuff. They've got things out there that could probably heal people, but they won't allow it. And they want people to be sick. We see that in the medical community, is that there's very simple things that they can address to help people, to prevent children from getting diabetes, having heart attacks, really, and all the other things that I can't mention. But they're not. And so you don't believe it. What do they use that technology for? To experiment on targets, to use mind control, to gaslight people, to covertly, move the power within their, their favorable framework, and that's it. They don't care. They use it for evil. So I don't ever believe them when they say they're developing something that's going to help, and then it just sits around, and then you find out they're using it, in the military or something. But okay. Emmanuel Godson, welcome to the live stream. Excuse me. My throat is getting pretty sore. Excuse me. I'm gonna have to get a drink of water here. And we're probably gonna have to cut the live stream short. I mentioned I do have an issue with that, but we're gonna keep going for a while here. Okay. Just looking through here. And Mr. Beach Walker has another comment. You always have such good comments, Mr. Beach Walker. I think there's so much we don't understand. Next level stuff no one knows about. Exactly. Yeah. That's the scary part, right? We find out they're doing this other stuff, but we're 50 years back still, you know, and it's horrifying. And then, some of this, like when people are trying to figure out whether they're dealing with witchcraft or some kind of government program, it's like you don't know at this point. That's how far advanced the human race is that they're up there and they have such, unimaginable technology now that it might as well be magic. It's like when I've mentioned before, you get somebody that would go out into the jungle with a Bic lighter or something, and these people thought they were like a god or whatever, but it really is just they don't know. They don't have that information. That's a good point. Okay. Okay. Well, guys, I do have to go to work. It's getting pretty late. I'd like to thank all of you for coming in here and acting like adults. I'd like to thank our moderators. And I'd also like to kind of recap what we talked about, a lot of the things that targets deal with in their stalking campaign. They deal with that exponential tyranny, the noise campaigns. We talked about that, street theater, directed conversations, fuming, covert poisonings, covert druggings, V2K, demonic harassment, role playing, emotional conditioning, sensitization, of course. And then you deal with the stuff that people are whispering, and just that environmental stuff that targets deal with, or giving the target, those looks, and some of the other techniques that are used after a target is sensitized for plausible deniability to gaslight them and make them, think they're going crazy, or discredit them in front of other people to destroy their reputation. And basically, blackball them or soft kill them within the professional community, in their family, in the social structure, or eventually just they're off somewhere on the fringe of society, or maybe in a mental institution, or worse. And it's a reality. I wonder that sometimes. Sometimes I'll think about that late at night because it's horrifying. Not just about me, because of course they scare targets with those things. And a lot of targets will wonder that, am I just going to go nuts? Is this stuff ever going to stop? And what's the purpose? And so on and so forth. And it's just mind boggling that you can even be dealing with that, and that it just keeps going. But they do that. And as I've mentioned before, it's attempted murder. Okay. It's very reckless. They're going to try and minimize it, but who knows what is going to happen. And there's always casualties. Try to focus on simplifying your life, guys, and try to focus on not reacting. And remember, they will be brought to justice. And as I talked about in the beginning of the show, there are different levels of God's justice, and they are storing up wrath, and hopefully they will repent. But it's no joke, and it is inevitable. I have some other links within the description. I've been putting the Lutheran Synod link up in there. I think it's a documented case of what has always been out there. And I've mentioned that before for targets that, you see something like MK Ultra or the spiritual abuse in the Lutheran Missouri Synod. It's like, that's not an isolated case. This stuff is everywhere, and I think targets are dealing with it, and other people are just blinded to it because, of course, it wouldn't work. If people found out about this stuff, it wouldn't be the weapon that it is. And in order to soft kill someone, in order to discredit them and put them out there on the fringe, isolated and minimized and discredited, they have to keep it hidden, because there are the two different groups, people who know and people who don't. I'd like to thank our moderators once again. God bless. Be good to yourselves. Be safe.